Roger Underwood has forgotten more about fighting bushfires than most people know. The one-time chief of what was then the government position, it was called the Conservation and Land Management Organisation in WA. Well, since 2002, he has been the driving force behind the bushfire front in WA. Now, you can find this incredible resource at bushfirefront.org.au. It's described as practical bushfire specialists, that group of people with hundreds of years accumulated experience in preventing bushfire damage to people, property and forests. Each member of the team of the Bushfire Front has worked in bushfire prevention, bushfire science, fire control planning, administration or operations, and some for over 40 years. Well, tonight I speak with Roger Underwood, starting with his article on the Eastern States bushfires. A recent article in the Sydney Sunday Telegraph paints a despondent picture. Horrible bushfires are the new normal because of climate change. The fire season, we learn, now extends to nearly 10 months of the year, and bushfires have become so intense they cannot be stopped before immense damage is done. According to former New South Wales Fire Commissioner Greg Mullins, now a member of the Climate Council, the price of inaction on climate change will increasingly be paid in lives lost and communities shattered. That's how you begin the article, then you pick it apart. Give me your thoughts on that opening paragraph.
Well, I don't agree at all with this climate change causes severe bushfires proposition. And there's a couple of reasons. One is that Australia is and always has been a bushfire-prone country. With the climate, the vegetation, the sources of fire, bushfires are always going to occur. On top of that, periodic drought is part of our history. And what we're seeing in New South Wales at the moment in particular, but we're also seeing it in Queensland and to a less extent in Victoria, we're seeing a deadly combination. It's a combination of drought plus heavy fuels plus sources of fire. That combination has always cropped up from time to time in Australian bushfire history, and every time it does, there is a bushfire disaster. Going back 100 years or more. This is not new, it's not unprecedented, it's entirely predictable.
So when you talk about fuels, let's explain that, because people get confused with the terms backburning and hazard reduction and burning off. What is fuel? What is a fuel load in a forest or in the bush?
Fuel is that stuff on the ground that comprises dry leaves and dry twigs and shrubs, branches, all the material on the ground that dries off, that catches a light in a fire. And the more of it you've got, the heavier the fuel, the more intense the fire and the harder it is to put out. And it gets to be, in Australian eucalypt forests, they move very quickly from being almost impossible to burn when they're carrying no fuel, through to being impossible to contain a fire after only about 10 years, because there is a constant building up of fuel on the forest floor. And if that fuel dries out, as it does in a drought, so that it all burns at once, your situation becomes pretty much impossible. Now, we advocate that the time to get rid of the fuel on the forest floor, bushland, bushfire fuels, the time to get rid of that is not in the middle of the fire season on a hot day. It's during the milder weather. Select the conditions carefully and do the burn yourself. And we call that prescribed burning or control burning or fuel reduction burning. And we are a strong advocate of that, because a fire is going to occur anyway. So you're better off to have a fire in a time of your own choosing than to have one in the worst possible time.
So there are often complaints in cities when there is prescribed or hazard reduction burning out in the bush and the winds blow that choking smoke into the city. But we've seen that in our cities with these out-of-control fires. So is that just the price we have to pay to keep control of bushfires?
In every area of life, Jane, you have to make trade-offs. And you have to trade off one slight inconvenience at one time for a major inconvenience at some other time. And smoke from prescribed burning is not all that bad. It's usually fairly mild and thin, and it lasts only a few hours, perhaps, if that. Smoke from a big, bad bushfire, as we saw in Perth here a few years ago, Perth was blotted out for 3 days by smoke. Really bad, dense smoke. You could hardly see your hand in front of your face. And so it's a matter of trade-off, yes. Prescribed burning, fuel reduction burning generates smoke, it must do. But that is far less of a problem than what happens in a wildfire.
How often should, and I know there won't be an easy fix answer for this because different forests grow at different rates and it would be dependent on the rainfall and the seasons that they've had, but if you're looking at a national park, how often should they have prescribed or hazard reduction burns?
It does vary. It varies with different types quite widely, but take one example, and that's the stringy bark forest that occurs in Western Australia and in Victoria and New South Wales. Those stringy bark forests accumulate fuel at about a rate of a tonne on a hectare per year.
A tonne per hectare per year?
Yes, so that after 5 years, well, let's say after 8 years, you've got 8 tonnes per hectare on every hectare of forest, 8 tonnes of fuel. And at that stage, fires become almost impossible for humans to control. Doesn't matter what you've got, you can have an army of firefighters, a squadron of water bombers, a fire in the forest burning in heavy fuels under high winds. Once the fuels get to a certain level, it's just too hot to handle.
So with one of the bushfires, one of the authorities was speaking and said, look, this was burned 5 years ago. There was a fire here 5 years ago. And people said, see, hazard reduction burning doesn't work. And I thought, well, if you left your backyard untended for 5 years, there'd be a fair bit of growth in there, wouldn't there?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, as time goes by, forests become increasingly more inflammable. So that is why prescribed fuel reduction burning is not a one-off. It's something that has to be done every year in a mosaic pattern across the whole area of forest, so that part of the forest will always be 0 years old and other parts will be 3-year-old and other parts will be 5-year-old and so on. And if you plan it strategically, you can make sure that the areas of young fuel, like the burnt only 1 year ago or 3 years ago, they're lying in a pattern across the predicted extreme winds that you get on a bad day in the summer. So, yes, I often have that argument put to me. People say, oh, look, the area was burnt 5 years ago and now it's burnt again, therefore prescribed burning is useless. They don't realise that prescribed burning is a process, a pattern, an annual event, which must be carefully planned out and handled.
Been a bit of discussion about what we learned from Indigenous Australians and their pattern of burning. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the Indigenous Australians had the game sewn up. They used to burn very frequently, and they even burnt in midsummer, and they could do that, and they could do it safely because when you burn only once every 2 to 3 years, the fuels are low and the fires are mild. And look, let's not remember that these people were living in the bush without wearing safety boots or sort of protective clothing, but they knew what they were doing. They were very skillful, they understood fire and they understood the vegetation, and they could burn very safely with this skillful knowledge, and they've been doing it for generation after generation, hundreds of generations.
What are the main elements now missing in the bushfire scene?
Well, the bushfire scene right across the eastern states of Australia is one of chronic mismanagement, in my opinion. They're asking for it and they're getting it. And I hate to say that, but that's a fact.
That's brutal.
And the missing elements, really there's 2 or 3 of them. The first is leadership. The rural people are not getting the good, strong, firm, far-sighted leadership from their governments that they should be getting. Too much kowtowing to urban elites. Fuels management is There's a huge backlog in fuels management. They're not doing enough of it and they're not doing it properly.
Well, one of the volunteers in New South Wales said 1% of the area that needed to be burnt, I'm presuming it was Crown land, had been burnt. 1%.
Yes.
It has hazard reduction burns.
You almost, it's not worth doing at 1%. It's got to be up around 8 to 10% to be any use whatsoever.
We saw a terrible loss. We saw terrible human costs. We saw 4 people die. We saw a terrible loss of property. For animal lovers, we saw 2/3 of a koala population decimated in, I think, Lake Innes. What I find extraordinary is that green groups and environmentalists who pertain to care about the wildlife don't want hazard reduction burns, which would seem to me be able to be controlled. We'd have a far greater impact on these precious animal populations. Am I right in assuming that?
It astonishes me, Jane, it really astonishes me that the environmentalists are prepared to sacrifice the forest and its wildlife to observe their ideology about prescribed burning and fuel reduction burning. I really can't understand that, because the forest, to me, I love it, and I love the wildlife.
Me too.
I love the beautiful trees. And to go out into these areas, I'm just putting aside the terrible loss of human life here, but to go out into these areas which were once beautiful forest and to see them incinerated breaks my heart. And I don't understand how you can be an environmentalist and not have your heart broken by that as well.
Look, there's been criticism that state forests were turned into national parks, particularly in New South Wales, that fire trails have been closed off, that fireys can't even get in there, that there hasn't been enough hazard reduction burning. We're nearly out of time, but what is your key message to those in authority and actually to people who are watching this who still don't understand?
My key message is that if you continue with business as usual, you will continue to have devastating fires in the future, irrespective of anything like climate change. You're staring down the barrel of a fiery future. Therefore, things have got to change. And the 2 things that most important that I think have got to change is inspiring and firm leadership from the top, and a far greater emphasis on reducing fuels during the mild times of the year.